Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's guest, Dr. Khuri, who, as you see, is a professor and Gazeta Chair of the Department of Hematology and Medical Oncology at Emory University. He's also a Deputy Director of the Winship Cancer Institute. I think many of you have had the opportunity to meet him either during his visit to Ann Arbor today or through prior professional meetings and conferences. But let me just briefly run through his bio. He received his bachelor's degree from Yale, subsequently his MD from Columbia, then was a resident in internal medicine at Boston City Hospital with Boston University, and a fellow at Tufts in hematology oncology. He started his academic career at MD Anderson, rising through the ranks to associate professor, at which time in 2002 he was recruited to Emory University as the division chief of hematology oncology. Subsequently, in 2008, he became the founding chair of the Department of Hematology and Medical Oncology. He's enjoyed a distinguished investigative career, has established an excellent record in lung and arrow cancers, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Khuri to Ann Arbor, where he will be talking to us about an academic's vision for cancer research, education, and care. So welcome.
Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I'm going to, as those of you who know me, and for reasons that I don't quite understand, actually probably have more friends on this campus than anywhere other than MD Anderson or Emory, where I've worked, and Harvard, which I've competed with my whole life, but it just happened that way. So thank you for having me, and I hope I don't put you to sleep. So we all have complex voyages, and I became a head, neck, and lung researcher for a very straightforward reason. My wife was a retinoid biologist. My parents actually met her parents in Boston. That didn't help me get an introduction to her. But I've enjoyed being what she describes as a modern nomad between Beirut, New Haven, New York, Boston, Houston, and thanks to Mike Johns, Atlanta for the last 12 years, which has actually been a wonderful place. And what I was going to do is talk a little bit about my research for those of you who are not painfully familiar with it. I actually had the good fortune of moving into medical oncology and cancer research just as the fingerprints, the long-sought fingerprints of tobacco-related carcinogenesis were becoming clear, first of all, with Curtis Harris's work on identifying the specific mutations that were signatures for lung cancer genomic damage, and then a couple of years later, a publication from MD Anderson Science Park essentially replicating that experiment in mice. So there no longer was any doubt, not that there ever was, that tobacco caused lung cancer. So what could we do about it? Obviously, as a protege of Ki Hong, who really was the reason I moved to Houston, I'm really not very good with horses or cattle or anything else, but I actually wound up loving my 7 years in Houston. We started to look at chemoprevention, and I was fortunate to get a job that my friend Greg Kalamkarian turned down, so there was a faculty position for me in Houston. And one of the first things we did is started to look, because I was always fascinated by molecular prognostics, even at the fundamental clinical level. Why did some patients do well? Why did others do less well? And one of our first discoveries, which ran counter to my lab mentor at the time, Ruben Lotan's contribution, was actually to find out that those patients that retained the expression of retinoic acid receptor beta, a gene that was associated, whose loss was associated with carcinogenesis in the aerodigestive tract and in the lung, we found out that actually its retention in primary lung tumors portended a worse prognosis because the gene itself and the protein were being regulated by growth factors and by cell cycle proteins. So that taught me one of my first really important lessons, which is no matter how attached you are to your hypothesis, your data always win. You could have a perfect hypothesis, but your data arm wrestle your hypothesis 7 days a week and twice on Sunday. So with that, I was disappointed that the large lung chemoprevention trial that we had led through RTOG and through MD Anderson really showed no difference in adding low-dose retinoids to patients who had had prior treatment with surgery and radiation for head and neck cancer, because we had not been in the era when the trial was launched to stratify patients by genomic or epidemiologic risk. And similarly, I had the misfortune to be the senior author on yet another large negative trial of chemoprevention in lung cancer using selenium, again, not stratifying patients by molecular risk. And what this study showed is that actually non-selective supplementation of selenium in patients with lung cancer who had been cured by their previous cancer did not impact second primary tumors and did not impact overall survival. So why am I showing you these slides? Am I trying to position myself as the Charles Mortel of thoracic oncology, recognizing that Charles Mortel ran 12 trials that were negative, and as the father of colorectal cancer, when he finally ran the positive trial, he unfortunately died of lung cancer, as you know, Max, before the trial turned out to be positive. No, I think you learn a great deal from positive and negative trials as long as you publish them and analyze the data objectively. So there are major things we've found out from these trials. First of all, I think it's put the capstone on non-selective trials of in lung or head and neck, or for that matter, prostate or breast cancer, in which patients are not stratified by their genomic background and by their molecular circuitry. And we also found out something that probably was obvious years ago, and that's that the cigarette is probably more powerful, in fact, is more powerful than any natural compound-based intervention. We don't have an intervention in our therapeutic or preventive armamentarium that can overcome some of the things that tobacco does. So what does tobacco do at the molecular level? Well, there are many things it does, but one of the things that it can do is it can upregulate COX-2 expression and capture reciprocal signaling circuitry between COX-2 and retinoids, which otherwise play a role in cell differentiation. And we were probably the first or among the first to show that the synergy, this negative synergy between COX-2 and retinoic acid receptor beta portends a worse outcome. And part of what I want to talk about is the fact that this may be targetable, but it should be targetable in the context of smoking cessation trials and in collaboration with South Central University in China, an institution that I've spent the better part of the last 7 years building a collaboration with. We're planning to run a trial of COX-2 inhibition with pharmacodynamic endpoints with smoking cessation in patients treated with lung and aerodigestive cancer. There are also opportunity to target this with oncolytic viruses, an enterprise whose engagement in led to my proximal move to Emory, because I think Jonathan Simons and I and 2 or 3 other people were among the small, relatively crazy club of people trying to inject viruses directly into tumors. We had a little bit more success in head and neck cancer in that we used an oncolytic virus that we injected directly into the tumor. We showed pretty good local control, but because of the challenges with doing a randomized trial in the United States in which half the patients got chemotherapy and the other half got chemotherapy plus the oncolytic virus, and then seeing Onyx sell the virus to Warner Lambert, who were then bought by Pfizer, something you know very well here, this trial never got off the ground. But this trial remains my only protection from the Charles Mortel Club, because as those of you in the head and neck cancer field know, a non-patented version of this virus was then entered into a phase 3 trial in China and was actually approved as a treatment for head and neck cancer in China. Of course, the equivalent to our FDA commissioner who approved it was subsequently put to death for graft, not related to this trial, so even that was a bit of a Pyrrhic victory. But we're still engaged in this. I think we are playing a role in the development of an IV virus, a reovirus, in which we're part of an international national collaboration with Jim Bonner at UAB and others in London and elsewhere. And this looks very promising in that just like the oncolytic adenovirus showed promise in patients where the tumor didn't have to have a p53 mutation, it just had to have defective response through p53. We know that most head and neck cancers have some signaling through RAS and PKR, but RAS mutations are rare. But if EGFR RAS signaling is activated, this virus replicates and it can be given as a reovirus much more easily intravenously, and we have some interesting results that may move into phase 3 soon. So at Emory, I was very lucky to learn yet another lesson in believing your own data. So we learned that targeting mutations, as we've seen in our role in the Lung Cancer Mutation Consortium, can be very nice. I'd still posit that in general, targeted therapy hasn't provided the cures in cancer that chemotherapy and radiation, those far more traditional approaches have, but that cell survival is essentially an escape circuitry that, for example, in the case of lung cancer, is often through LKB1, and we have a collaboration with Kwok Wong at the Dana-Farber, and Adam Marcus and Suresh Ramalingam are leading a new PO1 that we're putting forward, looking at the balance between cell survival and cell death, targeting LKB1 and BAX. So I use this work to say that nothing I ever did, I did on my own. In fact, on the rare occasions when I've tried to do something on my own, either at home or in academia, my much smarter wife has said, really bad idea. You fit well as part of a team. And this is a team science concept that I developed with Haiyan Fu, who's the leader of the Chemical Biology Center at Emory, and has been really a wonderful research partner. We also have a Head and Neck Explorer, as you do, in a no-cost extension, which is focused on prevention, nanotherapeutics, and cancer cell metabolism. So what does that have to do with the University of Michigan? What has my prior training to do with why all of you are sitting here at 5:25 wondering, what is he talking about anyway? We could just look at his CV. Well, I think this is not even a good to great opportunity. This is a great to greatest opportunity. And why? Well, you have to look at what is present in the environment that you come into. At Emory, I was asked by Mike Johns to build HemOnc and by Jonathan Simons to build the clinical arm of the Cancer Center. Here, you've got a cancer center whose basic theme is distilled as committed to the conquest of cancer through innovation and collaboration. The center's already 7th in NCI funding among all NCI-designated cancer centers, and 2nd in NCI funding among AANC medical schools, 3 SPORs, 6 PO1s, 11 U grants at last counting. I'm sure this could be updated, even though I tried to get this from 3 months ago. You probably have 13 U grants. I know that Carol and company are putting in the SPOR again. But what can we do to make an impact here? And so that I decided to step back and reflect, and this may be the cause of regret or reflection for you in the next hour, to look at what the state of Michigan is about, what the university is about, and what the culture of striving for excellence is, and how that intersected with my own life story. So I don't think anybody in this audience needs an introduction to who this is. Henry Ford, who discovered that some of Mike's ancestors and mine had unique features with regard to work ethic, which is that they didn't go on strike because they needed to send money home to the mother country. So here's a characterization of people being brought from the Near East, from what was then Syria and Lebanon, including my grandfather, who was a Michigan graduate, my great aunt, his sister. And here's a family of a group of children from the Middle East who basically came to Michigan with their families. Why? because America was the land of opportunity and still is the land of opportunity. And I would argue that Michigan in 2014 is that key capsule of America that is the land of opportunity. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in my talk. That was really eloquent. And I'll step outside my shoes as a clinical investigator with a good background in biology to talk about some of the drivers of progress in cancer research and hopefully in academic medicine. So what do you need to do to build what Henry Ford built in Detroit, what Max Wisha built here, what Mike Johns has built now at 2 universities and the dean has built here? What you need is to look back and understand that the culture of bringing great people together is evolving. People like to say that great leaders are born and made, but the reality is that real leadership development nowadays doesn't take place in a safe cocoon that's the classroom. As this article that I picked up from 4 years ago from the Harvard Business Review makes a case for, real leadership development takes place under conditions of real stress. And fully a third of leaders at every level are in flux. There are reasons for their disengagement, their dissatisfaction, but those don't diminish from the potential of those individuals to impact things. From this perspective, I find that Michigan is ideally positioned because one of the key elements is the space to train the next generation of leaders, and it starts with T32 grants in academic medicine, training grants for clinical investigators and physician scientists to differentiate and to role model. Why is role modeling important? Well, I feel awkward saying this to a dean who's made his career studying education, looking at role modeling as a science. But most of the data we see from medical schools and other academic enterprises suggest that there is a culture of modeling going on in academic medicine, not that dissimilar to what you see with children in a preschool. By that I mean that we had a study at Emory run by Bill Ely, my good friend and our executive associate dean, that essentially showed that students, medical residents, and subspecialty fellows, and even junior faculty, picked up habits, good and bad, from their teachers, from their faculty. If the faculty disparaged other departments, if they admired the faculty member, they got that into their habit. If the faculty was generous with other departments, if the faculty member was a good role model in terms of collaboration and constructive criticism, there was some adherence to that behavior. And that's an advantage you have because of this culture of collegiality and collaboration. But you also need excellence. Excellence based on clinical, basic translational research outcomes, health cancer prevention, and with the recruitment of the great Dr. Ayanian, a phenomenal presence in health policy. These are all things, along with the culture, that I think position Michigan to be a dominant leader in cancer research and patient care. But as the great Satchel Paige once said, don't look back, someone may be gaining on you. And that was his way of saying, don't get too comfortable with where you are. You need to always be moving forward, always be trying to impact and to improve in order to get to the next level. And that's what I was charged with at Emory. One thing that's easy from building, as Max and Marcy know from great detail, when you start with 30 faculty members covering 6 hospitals, and 7 of them are part-time, and most of them, when you offer them to be full-time, say, no, I think I'm going to retire and do something else. You know that you have something of a carte blanche to build a program the way that you think it should be built. So I was very lucky. With a lot of support at Emory, we built the MD and the PhD faculty up to about 80 faculty, and we project to grow to 100, and this is just for the Department of Hemonc. The Cancer Center has done something different. We had about 160 members. We now have 164 members. But with good guidance, what we now have is 164 fully engaged members, and now we're reaching out to the School of Public Health, the School of Nursing, the Yerkes Primate Center to say, who can we engage to make them card-carrying full members of the cancer center, whatever that will take in order to get to the next level, a level that you've already reached. And with that comes one of the most challenging things, which is trying to have an institutional footprint in clinical trials. So last night at dinner, Max was asking me what I was most proud of. What could I distill? Well, one of the things I'm most proud of is not necessarily the increase in clinical trials, although that's obviously very good, and that was my job. So I was never someone who thought you should be patted on the back for doing your job. What I'm proud of is when I got to Emory, our patients had access to drugs pre-FDA approval in cancer in the 5-year period that encompassed 1997 to 2002, and it wasn't meaningfully different until 2004 when we started to climb. And I'll talk about that climb a little bit. Patients had access to drugs before they were FDA approved in cancer only 10 to 15% of the time. But if we look at the last 7 years, patients have access to those drugs before FDA approval, often in phase 1 or 2, 75% of the time. And that's a number that's competitive with the MD Andersons and Dana-Farbers. How did we do that? Well, you do that in ways of devolution and evolution. Devolution, we had to close clinical trials. I closed 64 clinical trials with the backing of really only Mike and the Associate Dean for Research, and 2 of those were reopened. Why did we close those trials? Poor accrual, poor data, both. Not a good trial for our patient population. Most of the faculty who I expected to march into my office and hang me in or burn me in effigy actually eventually said, "We're glad you did it. We're glad someone did it." Why were they glad? Because we all have an infinite amount of time on this planet Earth? No, of course not. We have a finite time, and you work 70, 80, 90 hours a week because you want to make an impact in the diseases that matter to you. So this freed up some of our best faculty and some of our best educators. Another thing I'm very proud of is that I saw something that bothered me deeply during my fellowship, and I thought that whatever else I do for the rest of my career, I want to stand up for it, which was there was a contretemps between the medical school at Tufts and the hospital about how we fund medical education. Who pays for medical education? Who pays for attending physicians, basic scientists, physician educators? Who pays for them? Who supports them to teach medical students and graduate students? And I think this is a recognition I'm particularly proud of. Our Executive Associate Dean, Bill Ely, who I had to convince to allow me to promote him to full professor with tenure, swept the university's top 2 teaching awards in 1 year. Jean Khoury, my chief of heme, who we recruited, is an inductee of AOA from the medical school class. Mary Jo Lekowitz was awarded one of the highest honors by the Emory University School of Medicine class of 2007 by having an award named after her, and then being elected 2 years later as the physician they'd most like to have as their treating doctor. And Ruth O'Regan has transformed our fellowship program into a nationally competitive top program where we really get people who become the major feeders for our faculty. And finally, after years of trying, something that seems to come so easy to you and the folks who are our friends in Baltimore, we have a T32 to train the next generation of molecular oncologists in clinical research and in translating bench discoveries to the bedside and taking them back to the bench for further improvement. And that's led by my executive vice chair and very close friend, Dong Shin, with Ruth O'Regan and Jintang Dong, giving clinical and basic science balance. So we've taken some risks at Emory, and I would have to say I've been extraordinarily well supported, not just from Emory, but from my mentors nationally. So I've been an extraordinarily fortunate individual. There are few people I know luckier than me. I've had a wonderful mentor in residency, Howard Koh, who always first of all, he convinced me to go to the Boston City Hospital, and he always encouraged me no matter how insane my ideas were. Ki Hong, who really was a transformative mentor in my faculty career, the late Bernie Weinstein, who changed how I looked, not just at clinical oncology, but really Bernie Weinstein opened my mind to the possibility of cancer prevention as a therapeutic target, and was always on the first plane to Emory when I started to get confused. And then, how often do you get to do this in your life? I actually recruited one of my best friends in medicine, Wally Curran, who's now our cancer center director, as chair of RADONC. And for me, it was an easy price. All the heavy lifting was done by Tom Lawley and others. I just gave up my job as clinical director of the cancer center to close the deal. And we've enjoyed 5 wonderful years working together with him as the director and me as the deputy director. But I've also tried to provide mentorship to bench and clinical scientists. And in Suresh Ramalingam, I think we have one of the preeminent stars in clinical investigation, not just in thoracic oncology, but in the world. If you could bet on a stock in clinical investigation, I would bet the house on Suresh Ramalingam. And it's been a lot of it in partnership with Haiyan Fu and Dong Shin. So what have I learned from my mentors? I've learned the importance of servant leadership. It can't be about you. I've talked about role modeling, but it's also about being a consistently good example in admitting to making mistakes. And, to be very candid, I moved to Emory in many ways to work with Mike Johns because my temperament is very similar in that I like to make decisions. I don't have a problem with making a decision. If there's a mistake, I'll fix my own mistake. But I was surprised at the transformative power for trainees of admitting that something that you launched for the best of intentions did not go according to plan. Of course, when you've got an impeccable track record in negative phase 3 clinical trials, it makes it a little easier to play humble pie. But, these studies suggest that much as we all aspire to train and to role model well for the best and the brightest, we often fail. I've criticized the emergency department, even though some of my friends are there, and I've criticized them in a way that disappointed me. But I've gone back not just to apologize, but to write their chair and to correct with my colleagues. And I treat our students and fellows as colleagues. Why did I criticize them? Was it in a constructive manner? What's the message you took? We all do this. But I think a culture of accountability and servant leadership, of treating one's colleagues as peers, produces that trust and that transparency that you need to get to the next level. Because clinical investigation, basic research, outcomes are all contact sports, and you are going to make mistakes. And someone once asked me, what's my best quality? And I said, wow, I think it's that I make a lot of mistakes, but I never make the same mistake twice because I own my mistake and learn from it. So I don't know that that's the best way to make your pitch, but it's, I think, the most honest way. So what are the challenges that we're facing in clinical cancer care? I think oncology and hematology are spectacular subspecialties. I would not change my career choice. I would not do anything to change that career choice. But we really need to start working on oversight, authority, accountability, improvements in the clinic, improvements in the patient experience, but not by doing it in isolation as physicians. We need to partner with nursing, social work, dentistry, psychiatry, all the disciplines that touch the patient. And one thing I learned from my first days at the Boston City Hospital is for every hour that we spend with a patient, the nurse spends on average 6 to 8 hours. So that's a ratio that should be pretty transparent. Collaborative partnerships with other disciplines are key. Making the care patient and family-centric is really key to turning around things like infusion centers. I don't know a top place, you name it, Michigan, Hopkins, Emory, and I'd like to think we're becoming a top place, Dana-Farber, MD Anderson, where you walk in anytime after 9 o'clock and say, take your choice of seats. It's empty. It's all yours. You want the A bay. These places are packed because cancer is a disease that will not go away in our lifetime, despite Dr. von Eschenbach's hopeful start. I think we have personnel shortages that we have to be honest about and deal with. Are we training people in the allied professions? Are there efficiencies with advanced practice providers? Do we have the best electronic order entry systems? And do we have the informatic depth and breadth to capture not just the patient on clinical trial, but I would argue even more importantly, those patients that don't go on clinical trial that represent the vast majority of cancer patients being treated in America and in the world. And to achieve all these things, you essentially have to set your ego aside, because you can have all sorts of destructive parallelism and turf wars, which really fall away when you focus on the mission, which is the patient, the best outcome for the patient. I'm much more interested in outcomes than patient satisfaction scores. Don't get me wrong. I believe someone told me that one of the strongest indicators of patient satisfaction scores, and I'll quote Marcy, was parking availability. Something that I've lost the argument for years at Emory when I said, just give them free parking. You'll drive our Press-Ganey scores up through the roof, and then our outcomes will shine through. But I've lost that like I've lost many other battles. But I think if we all decide what we want to do, and my sense is at Michigan there is that unity of purpose, then you need the right type of leaders to effect it in all aspects, in clinical investigation, in education, in basic research, outcomes, nursing. And candidly, no one can afford to ignore the bottom line, because the bottom line, which is something that we've grown aggressively, including payer mix, at Emory, is what allows us to offer the best care to patients, irrespective of their insurance status. I promised myself and my late father that when I went into medicine, I would never do a wallet biopsy and allow it to alter the way I cared for a patient. I attended Grady and I attended Emory. And the B query doesn't show up at Grady or Emory. It's always the A query, good or bad. And I think that's a culture that with the leadership of Sagar Lonial and Ruth O'Regan, we've inculcated at our institution. Yes, the bottom line is important, but the saying from Field of Dreams is true. If you build it, they will come. You've got to watch and mind the books. You've got to grow the clinical volume, but you've got to be aware of the payer mix. And as you can tell, we're crucially aware of the payer mix. But we have to be careful at not worshiping at an altar of a false god. The salad days of excessive fees for infusional chemotherapy, for radiation, for other highly technical specialties will end. And the winner or winners will be the institutions that have the best outcome, that in my opinion deliver the highest quality of research-driven patient care, such that patients have access to their own data, that physicians go back to spending quality time with patients instead of 5 minutes between encounters, and the net outcomes of the institutions, and my bet is on the academic institutions, show that yes, as data has suggested from studies at Dartmouth and other institutions, that the NCI-designated cancer centers actually have better survivals than places where it's doc of the month. And I really believe that this will ultimately drive it, not our payer mix. That will help our payer mix. But to do that, sometimes you have to build it where they are. This is an interesting small slide that I wanted to point out. I think the days when patients accepted that all of them had to come to be treated at the ivory tower are ending. Most phase 1 patients will continue to be treated at the academic medical center. I'm not an advocate for spinning off early drug development in community practice. Where it's been done extraordinarily badly, even by really good practices. They can run phase 3 trials with good regulations. But we've made an effort to build community oncology at St. Joseph's Hospital, a hospital that Emory has acquired controlling interest in, by having a mix of subspecialty oncology and general oncology. But with the general oncologists we're recruiting, we are differentiating them to some degree. We're insisting they attend 3 to 4 tumor boards, and all of these can be done by Skype or by by other means, but they have to develop a focus and expertise in an area in addition to their general oncology. And with that, we've seen growth in referrals and not just in reallocation of patients. And I would argue that this presents real opportunities to capture data and, in rare cases, to impact lives. So this was a patient who I had the good fortune to approve their charity care, who actually got a complete remission and remains in CR with a really aggressive case of myeloma 2.5 years later, and was presented at an ASH oral session the study was presented in an ASH oral session 2 years ago. And part of that is assembling pharmacologists, advanced practice providers, nurses, a leading physician in Sagar Lonial, and a new medical director for our infusion center in Jonathan Kaufman, someone who is my second chief fellow, who we groomed as a classical clinical investigator, not just to develop trials, but to develop the surroundings, including our phase 1 unit, which puts about 150 to 200 patients a year on phase 1 trials. And this was a custom-designed phase 1 unit of 12 beds where we could do aggressive monitoring for 12 hours per day, where with Emory Healthcare making a major contribution, the last $150,000 was actually found and contributed by the investigators in our department. It had to, a great fiscal leader, Dick Debs, who was CEO of Morgan Stanley, once told me when I was trying to establish an endowed chair in my late father's name at the American University of Beirut, that if something really matters to you, it's got to hurt. And in this case, for people to contribute their startup funds to the development of our phase 1 unit at 10, 25, 50,000 really made it all the more meaningful. So that goes to my next point. We're obsessed with capturing perfect data on patients on clinical trials. But I would argue that medicine is one of those disciplines where, like a fine wine, if you're really committed, you get better with age. And just like Malcolm Gladwell had his 10,000 hour rule, I've invented the 10,000 patient rule. There is no question that Dan Hayes is a much better breast medical oncologist from treating more than a couple of hundred breast medical oncologists. You learn things, but we currently use a great filing system to capture that data from every patient experience, and we call that our memory bank. That cannot persist. I would argue that a robust informatics system is necessary so that every patient encounter is meaningful and you can capture that data in a meaningful time, not just the people who do exceptionally well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. This is a gentleman who's been on EGFR targeted therapy for 10.5 years with stage 4 lung cancer. And here's an individual with head and neck cancer who was cured of disease that my friends and former partners in Houston thought was essentially untreatable, unresectable. Gary Clayman recommended a total laryngopharyngectomy, but really working with their pathologists and our pathologists, we essentially decided that a watch and wait approach that was better, that the cells that were left after chemoradiation from the biopsy were apoptotic, and we could afford close follow-up to patients who do exceptionally poorly. By the way, all of these patients have allowed me to use their pictures on this slide. Patients whose disease grows on primary chemoradiation therapy when it's supposed to be adjuvant chemoradiation for N2 disease with lung cancer, but whose disease grows with every dose of radiation almost. So how do we measure that? There are some easy measures. How do we measure accomplishment? There's productivity in journals, and I'm sure Michigan could throw up a list of leaders and thought leaders that publish in these journals, and better and more consistently. But I'm proud of the fact that there's a consistency from our cancer center members. Every year, we celebrate some of our faculty who are making major advances, either as the leaders or as the contributors to the enterprise, and that our grant portfolio has changed from 3 expiring R01s and whatever grants I moved from MD Anderson to a dozen R01s, R03s to R21s, et cetera. I think a diverse funding base, including multi-investigator grants is a necessity for the future. And multi-investigator grants are even harder in many ways to get than the single investigator grants, because not only does your grant have to be viewed as outstanding or to exceptional or just plain exceptional, it has to be seen as synergistic or thematically suited to the other projects in that grant. And that's a challenge that was touched on in a recent issue of Science. How did we get here, and how do we make progress? And so I thought this was a very insightful article called Chasing the Money that was published almost 3 months ago in Science, and it focused on a whole group of people talking about how scientists were differentiating. They were becoming administrators. They were becoming more reliant on philanthropy. Some were just striking gold left, right, and center. But if you look at grant dollars that are available to us, there has been a change, and not for the better, from the salad days of the 90s. In terms of the appropriations value in 1998 dollars, there's a real decline. And that's been represented by the number of people funded. In 2000, 32% of R01 grants were eventually funded. That's 17% now. That's with all in, with resubmissions, with the A1. This doesn't take into account the ability now to resubmit your grant after the A1 fails, but also the number of principal investigators remains the same, even though the applicant pool has increased dramatically. So this was one solution that I liked. A very well-funded faculty member said in Science, if my mother opens up a funding opportunity, I will submit an application. So that, I think, is innovation and opportunism lacking a little bit of realism. I don't know about you, but I don't think that's my mother's top priority, is to fund my research or yours. But I think philanthropy is a badly underrated enterprise. You could argue I have no shame or I have no stoppers, but I have no problem asking a patient of an outstanding faculty member of mine when their disease is in remission, or if the family is especially happy with the care, to help make a donation to fund what I would argue is the great differentiator of American society, which is entrepreneurial discovery of new ideas, new approaches, and new research. And so Howard Halpern, the patient I talked about, whose disease we treated and who turned out to be really in a durable long-term remission with chemotherapy, chemoradiation, and a neck dissection, Carol, wound up pledging for a $2.5 million chair. And when I got to Emory, we had one endowed professorship, the Blomeyer, and then in 2006, Mike agreed to allow me to convert the corpus of the Goizueta Fund. By the way, Roberto Goizueta was the CEO of Coca-Cola who died of lung cancer. And I made a compelling case to Mike that it should be an endowed chair for a lung cancer researcher. And I know a good lung cancer researcher who would gladly give up his smaller endowed chair for this chair. So I gave Dongshin the Blomeyer, but since then we've raised a half dozen other chairs, and we just closed on it something that even I thought was a long shot, which was an endowed chair for hemostasis and hemophilia in our department, an area that I want to point out is at great risk because the training of classical hematologists is something we seem to have gotten away from. This is a key area. So what have I been talking to you about? This is the home of champions and innovators. I put Arul Chanayan in because every time I read, he's getting another paper in Nature or Science or another patent. I don't know how he or Steve Eiserman would feel about being next to each other, but this is a favorite of mine. The first World Series that I watched, and I love baseball and soccer, and someone at some point will tell me what happened in Germany, Algeria, was the 1968 World Series. I wasn't quite old enough to figure out why my beloved Boston Red Sox lost to the St. Louis Cardinals except for two words, Bob Gibson. So in 1968, I was 5. I was watching the World Series, and Mickey Lolich, who was no Bob Gibson, was pitching against Bob Gibson, but Mickey Lolich won 3 games and was the World Series MVP. Why am I talking about Mickey Lolich to a group of people who would like to go home? Well, Mickey Lolich made a lot of mistakes, but he didn't make mistakes in the most important event of his life. And the point about mistakes is if you scare people from making mistakes, I truly believe you never really get great work. You have to acknowledge, own, even celebrate some of your mistakes and move on from them. And Mickey Lolich was a prime example. So is Steve Yzerman. He lost a lot of big games before he became an irrepressible force. Glenn Rice. I'm waiting for Dr. Chennaiyan's first mistake, so bad slide. So what can be the vision for Michigan? I've already told you, a research juggernaut, great clinical care. But to paraphrase Satchel Paige, even the best have to evolve to compete in this environment. The funding base is shrinking. Competition for patients, for grants, for philanthropy is everywhere. So even the very best, and the University of Michigan is certainly among the very best, if not the very best, at cancer and in having 8 top 10 schools, which no other university can match. And that evolution is something that the leadership here, the faculty, the staff, the dean, the EVPMA, the president have to all buy into. And I think the easiest thing to say is the key is to better engage the thought leaders, both the ones that you want to attract to the cancer center and the ones that are already inside the cancer center. It would be a very interesting day if a new cancer center director were to walk up to the remarkable collection of basic scientists here and said, you know, you guys are great, but why don't you survive on your own for a few years? I'll get back to you. I'm going to build the clinical operation. It doesn't work that way. Everything has to grow synergistically, and there will be some mistakes. There will be some recruitments that don't quite pan out the way one would hope. We would own them, and we would learn from them, and we would build after them. So here's my top 10 list. What are the things that could take an already great cancer center potentially to the next level? I think building and prioritizing a universally recognized service line for the University of Michigan, a cancer service line which is all in, radiology, imaging, pathology, clinical investigation, what goes to research, what goes to surgery. Have an idea of what your total investment, your total assets are in this area, and then make a rational decision on whether you need a cancer hospital, whether it takes you to the next level. Build on the wealth of multi-investigator grants by further integrating clinical translation, nursing, and public health. Enhance your portfolio in translational clinical research, expand your outcomes health policy and prevention research efforts by bringing those to front and center. You have really some of the most exceptional talent in these areas that anyone has. They need to be brought forward from a supporting role to a front and center role. I think Max is a phenomenal Pied Piper, and he's not going anywhere, but we need to build on the philanthropic opportunities to support 3 things: faculty, programs, and infrastructure. Those are the things that great places are built around. And support and enable innovation and translation of University of Michigan discoveries into the clinic. Take your own ideas and capitalize them. Take them into phase 1. They're worth much more if you find a dose and a biomarker. Invest in basic research, discovery, cancer prevention, and start looking at the North Campus, which has to be one of the best deals I've ever seen. Max drove me around yesterday, and I thought the Bayer agreement for Yale was something. This is a different scale altogether. So my hat's off to the dean and to all of you who played a part in that remarkable acquisition. Train the next generation of translational clinical trialists. You know what's much better than recruiting an entirely new group of faculty? Training them. We've turned our fellowship programs into a group of clinical investigators who can support working with our best scientists in discovery. And go out into the community, build a blended network of specialists and general oncologists of different disciplines. Go man the distant parts of Michigan with radiation oncology, who's already there. Get better informatics and think about enhancing your already very good but somewhat sporadic international contacts. Cancer is a worldwide disease. Building relationships in China, Africa, the Middle East is not going to be optional to really be at the top. And finally, develop and market the Michigan brand as the dominant brand, initially in the American Midwest. For the life of me, I've never figured out why anyone would go, no offense, to the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic as opposed to come here. This is the marquee medical university and university in the Midwest. Why are you keeping it a secret? I'm not sure. Get it out there. Get it in the media. So I want to end, and my apologies to the many people I've left off. There is no doubt that the quest for innovation and collegiality in cancer at Michigan is alive and well. You've got remarkable people, and I wanted to offer my personal congratulations to Xiaomeng Wang, who made his plane to France, which I asked him to leave in time, for being named the university's Innovator of the Year. You've got no shortage of people who are willing to take risks and support new ideas. And you've got some incredible people who you can role model. And for me, it was easy. I had a wonderful pair of parents and a father who always pushed me not only to follow knowledge like a sinking star, but to think of myself as fortunate to the degree that I should serve those less fortunate. And I'll stop there and take any questions. I'm sorry if I've gone over.
Questions for Dr. Khuri?
Where's Mickey Lolich when we need him now?
Where's Mickey Lolich? What?
When we need him now.
I don't know. Maybe I'm Mickey Lolich. We'll see. I think probably Mickey Lolich is your soon-to-be departed Max Scherzer, personally. I'm guessing this is the year for the Tigers, but we shall see. Yes?
So you posed a very interesting question that I don't have the answer to, which is who's going to pay us to teach?
So I believe in an all-in strategy. And the way we designed our department is we don't fractionate the faculty. Yes, we, like every other institution that gets federal dollars from Medicare to teach residents, we commit to filling out our surveys. But you can't buy 0.7 of me and say, you know, the 0.5 of teaching is a luxury, or the 0.10. It really has to be a holistic approach. And I think that's playing to people's strengths and having a careful inventory of the faculty you have who are truly exceptional teachers. You already have the equivalent of our medical educator track. In fact, you had it before us. But celebrate those individuals, give them awards, nominate them for national awards and societies. You know, from my perspective, there's very little discussion on the role of the educator in medicine, be they PhD or MD, but it's a key priority. And it's a very cost-effective approach. If this person helps develop the next generation of outstanding physicians, scientists, or investigators, you're really doing quite well from that perspective. And I think rather than just say, medical school will pay for it, the hospital will pay for it, you guys are lucky because it's essentially one enterprise. And I believe that the dominant academic medical institutions will be the ones like Michigan or Emory where it's all in, not where you have an affiliation with a hospital, where you essentially own the business and you understand that a central part of your mission is to educate the next generation. Yes?
How do you view interactions with private industry, big pharma, biotech, et cetera, moving forward?
Well, you know, collaborations with industry at Emory are strictly verboten, so we don't talk to them. No, it's a very interesting time in the interaction between academic medicine and big pharma, because big pharma has scaled back massively their R&D. So there, by necessity, has to be much more research and development in academia. But we're terrible negotiators. We basically give it to them. Please take my idea. I only want my idea to make a difference for patients, which is great. And it's the right thing to think. But we should own a share of the profits. And institutions have not quite figured out how to do it. Emory, after the $540 million settlement that Mike was a part of for the AIDS drugs that Dennis Leota and Ray Shinazi developed, decided that they would, and it's nothing to do with Mike, this happened in the last 3-4 years, scale down the percentage that went to the investigator in their lab. And I was sitting there talking to our head of tech transfer, and I said, and you thought this would help? How? So I think, like everything else in life, it's about partnerships. It's about partnerships between the institution and the faculty members. It's about partnerships between the institution and pharma and biotech, not just to capitalize in terms of making sure those realities move forward, but to make sure that a fair share does return. And having a very good tech transfer office and having the sort of brand name that you have and having the number of companies you're spinning off. I know Xiaomeng himself has spun off 3 companies, all with interesting ideas. You essentially have a finite number of dollars and people to spend them on. And in my mind, supporting discovery is incredibly valuable in many ways. Yes, sir.
There's a complex relationship between basic research programs and clinical programs in academic medical center/service. And that's played out very much in cancer center, right in the middle of that. That complexity is, research is essentially a loss-making entity usually, but then the hospital system needs it, the medical school and research for that type of panache that makes you leading. So could you speak to that a little bit in terms of your vision of how those two entities can coexist?
So I think it's a very fractionated analysis that says research is a loss leader or is a loser. It might be a loss leader, which is deceptive. A loss leader is really something that, for example, medical oncology, believe it or not, is a loss leader. But you make money downstream on imaging, on chemotherapy, on bone marrow transplantation, on all these other key parts, on hospitalization. Same for head and neck surgery. You always hear that, head and neck surgery, the DRGs are terrible. You're not making money in the OR, but you have a tremendous footprint in the hospital and on the system. Similarly, research is not, in my opinion, a money loser. If you look at the data sets that I've seen, including at MD Anderson, certainly clinical research having trials makes money for them because it attracts patients. Basic research, it's a more complex analysis. Basic research is what differentiates the institution. The discoveries pay for things, but also being at an academic medical center is a known driver of patient referrals. Most patients want to be at a place that they perceive to be at the cutting edge. And it doesn't seem to me possible that anyone would think that an institution can be at a cutting edge without basic research. It's called basic for a reason. So I think if you look at it's always easy to sort of cut off the legs of the spider and just say, she might be able to function fine without legs, but it's I think a flawed analysis in my opinion. But, Jamie, you had a question, which I'm sure will be a piece of cake.
So you were really eloquent about the need to make mistakes. Would you give us, as a cancer center director, would you give us an example of the sort of mistake that you feel that you should be allowed to make, and maybe an example of one that you shouldn't be allowed to make?
So I'll give you an example of each, and we'll see how close to the mark I am. So recruitment is not an exact science. And you rarely are able to get people from other institutions who are model citizens, tremendous innovators, are perfectly happy in their institution and have no reason to leave. And by the way, they're funded up the wazoo, okay? So if you find these creatures, Jamie, can you call me? Because that's like the dodo bird or the neuro-oncologist. I think they exist, but I'm not sure. So you're always taking a chance. You're taking a chance based on 3 principles, and I'll get to the mistake you shouldn't make, okay? You're taking, Mike asked me years ago, what do you recruit based on? Basically 3 things: talent, character, and fit. Someone could be the world's greatest GU medical oncologist, but if I have 5 and I don't have the volume to support them, and if this person who's fantastic and they're at MD Anderson, and I've known them since childhood, they want to come, there's no fit, even if I can check off talent and character. So I think you should be allowed to make a mistake in that space. You should be able to recruit someone who looks spectacular, and you may not have an immediate opening, but you do your homework and you check their references, and always check the references. Those are some mistakes I've made that I don't want to repeat. Talk to people you trust. And part of that is knowing people around the country. Is this a good citizen? Is this a team player? Are they a star? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Do they fit our culture? And, the Michigan culture, I think, is well described as collegiality and innovation. So what's the sort of mistake a leader shouldn't make? The mistake a leader shouldn't make, a cancer center director shouldn't make, is to bank on, and if you want to use recruitment or you want to use program, a cultural transformation that's not a good fit for the ethos of their organization. So let's say Michigan falls in love with, cancer immunotherapy, which is the sexiest thing out there. And Max decides he wants to channel, or a successor decides he wants to channel our friend who developed the Pittsburgh Cancer Center, our late friend who is a phenomenal program builder. Is that the best fit for what you have? I don't know. But would moving an entire unit and its leaders to a place where they don't fit be positive or negative? I would not make that mistake if I thought that they would have an effect on the culture that was beyond. I can live with something that's beyond my ability to predict, but I would not live with something that's beyond my ability to fix and remediate. That doesn't mean we don't take risks, but that means it's best to bring people who check off those 3. Another example of a mistake that I've seen made by cancer center directors, which is where you mortgage the farm on a single retention. And the ripple effects are, now all your other stars are thinking, wow, dad or mom only love him or her. What about me or me? So those are mistakes I think you should make. You should know your resources, know your culture, and manage to enhance that culture, not to shatter it, especially if it's really a superb culture as you have here.
All right. Well, given the hour, I think we will end. I want to thank you again, Dr. Khuri, for a very kind and enlightening discussion. Thank you.